there's not a place in the world for a film to be that long about Willy DeVille. But it was, the big challenge with Willy was that he had this incredibly long career that there are very few people who knew all of it. Like, there are lots and lots of people who knew pieces of it, and of course it was on, 2 and even more continents that it happened on. And, if, for example, just one of those bizarre things, right? In Europe, of course, I think everybody knows he was bigger than he was here. But, for example, with The Princess Bride, which in America is probably the thing he's most known for. I mean, obviously CBGB stuff, people know about that, but in terms of all of America, that movie is a huge deal. If you were born after 1970, that movie is your Wizard of Oz. So, I mean, that's a big deal, that song. But in Europe, that movie was not successful at all. And so they didn't know anything about any of that. So it was a lot of this idea of like trying to piece together all these different parts of his life. The end, obviously in Europe, he still had an audience, but in America, really, it past like, say, 1985 or 86, I mean, he never even had a record release in this country until after he was gone. I mean, he's really more famous now because of streaming and YouTube than he ever was then. So that was the biggest part. I was determined, and we all worked together on this, to tell a whole story. I didn't want it to be just like the CBGB, Capitol Records, punk rock days. I thought what was different about Willy was he wasn't a burnout, right? He wasn't a guy who disappeared, who died of an overdose. He kept going, and he kept doing new things. And to me, he's the accumulation. To get Willy DeVille, you have to appreciate that you have to listen to more than one thing. You have to give yourself up to him, and you have to be patient and to absorb all that he did. When you do, then you think, my God, who can I think like him? I can't think of anybody like him. Crispin is, obviously, as you'll talk about, has been out on the road with everybody in the world. And he was having a conversation with Southside Johnny, right? And Southside Johnny is like, pretty much like as intelligent as they go about the history of rock and roll in his era. And he was saying, I don't know anybody like Willy DeVille. I can't think of anybody like Willy DeVille. And so to me, that was the big conundrum, and also the big thing we were trying to get was how can you put it all in one package, and how can you make people appreciate the wholeness of it?
When we first started, one of the first things we did was we went to Los Angeles. This is like 9 years ago, at least.
10 years ago.
10 years.
10 years ago.
And we did, talk to a bunch of people, but one person, I have an old dear friend who's named John Eskow, who's a screenplay writer. He wrote Air America and Zorro.
Mask of Zorro,
Mask of Zorro. But we're really old friends, from way back, and we were in a band together when we met in the mid-'70s in New York. He was a Willy DeVille fan. He saw me play with Willy in the 80s. So we met with John, and we sort of said, what's the underlying structure of this guy's story for a movie? And he thought about it, and he said, it's the poet maudit, Poete, the French poet maudit, which he explained is
essentially an artist who's so lost in what he was doing that it becomes almost like a torment, right? And in a lot of ways, that's what Willy was. He was just absolutely, purely an artist. And he was an artist to the point in time where, as many of them are, it almost becomes like a problem. And that's what we sort of went with, this idea that like he had this vision from when he was young, he was determined to do what he wanted to do, and he was determined to pay whatever price he had to pay for it, even though, he didn't enjoy it, et cetera. And that's, in a way, what we did with the film. If you watch the sort of through line of the film, it's exactly that.
Poet maudit, was originally coined to refer to people like Rimbaud, French surrealist poets, I think, right? But
right.
But John, our friend, said, this is what Willy was. And that, we kept that in mind over the years, because, we sifted through so much interview stuff. We couldn't put as you said, we couldn't put everybody in, but people came out of the woodwork that I knew for being Willy DeVille fans, including Bob Dylan, Boz Scaggs, who recorded Mixed Up, Shook Up Girl about 4 years ago on one of his last albums, Tom Petty, besides Peter Wolf, of course. Who else? Tom Waits. He was an influencer. He really, really was. It's just his career, though, and his life just didn't follow the pattern,
Nick Flynn, who's in the film, is good friends with somebody you all would know about, Warren Zanes, who's a member of the Del Fuegos, and Warren's become quite the scholar, et cetera. And Warren went on and on and on with Nick about how Warren had talked with Tom Petty at length about who Willie was and what Willie's place was in rock and roll. And so definitely he got into people's souls. He got into people who were important and influential in music in a deep way. And, to me, it's like he's a real artist. I mean, I say it over and over again, but Willie was a real artist. He wasn't like a commercial artist. He was a real artist.
The first time I played with him, my friend Louis Cordelesi called me to sub for him on a tour of Europe. And we started out with a gig in New York City at a place called the Ritz, if you remember. It's now called Webster Hall. And, I had rehearsed with the band, but I hadn't actually rehearsed with Willie himself. I'd met him. And we came out on stage, started playing something, and I think it was You Better Move On by Arthur Alexander. And Willie came out, and there was a pin spot on me, had a cigarette, and the wisps were going up. And he stood in at the mic, packed house, and just the first note he sang, I started to get shivers. And it just really hasn't happened to me very many times in my life. Wilson Pickett, I used to work with him. He would give me shivers. But it was just extraordinary, the physical presence of his voice. And it stayed that way, through time. That's the amazing thing. Even when he got ragged there at the, in Berlin, he had a way of communicating vocally that was just uncanny, I thought.
You want to talk about them? I would say actually, to me, it's I thought to myself, well, what's different about doing something? I want to hear stories from you all. I'm sure that a lot of you saw Willie, and Willie played up here a lot. Obviously, he's from Connecticut originally. And so, we have obviously Peter and we have Nick Flynn talking about it. And your friend, the writer, talked about seeing him at the Paradise in Boston. His son's also up in upstate New York. Yeah, but I'm saying I'd like to hear what you all have to say about seeing Willie in person and what you think about the film and also what you thought about him.
I got one more thing to say about Boston and Willie. He was really into playing in Boston, and I played with him, I remember, I think at the Paradise in the mid-'80s, and yeah. And I have that picture up on my Facebook page. My friend John Franklin took a great picture of me on stage with Willie, and I put that on my Facebook page. I know I played with him a couple of more times, I think, in the Boston area. He absolutely loved Boston audiences.
So why don't we open it up for some questions, or if you have a quick story, that would be fine too. And raise your hand, speak loudly. I'll repeat if we need to, right there. Yeah, the question was whether Willie moved from New Orleans to New York for better health care because he had gotten sick.
No, they moved from New Orleans to New Mexico.
Yeah, to New Mexico, but they lost their house. Actually, New Orleans to Mississippi, they had a little plantation, and then they lost the house to taxes, and they moved to New Mexico. It's not in the film per se, but primarily because one of Willie's friends from Stanford he knew lived out there. And also Willie by then was very much moving into, as you can see in the film, Southwestern music. He was very into the Americana, and Willie always wanted, that was a big thing with Willie. He when he would do music, he would also become the character the incarnation. And so that was part of it. He wanted to be in the part of the world where the music was coming from to sort of absorb the whole thing. But then he came back to New York primarily because he was just busted. And Nina brought him back. She had an apartment on 12th Street, and they moved into this little apartment. That's where he lived the last 7 years of his life with her.
While in New Mexico, as we show in the film, Lisa hung herself in the garage. And I guess he was out driving and he came home and the garage door was open, the lights on, and she was,
More questions out there?
Well, there's a lot because what we wanted to do with the film was I wanted as much as possible to me, him and not people talking about him. So as I said, I think it was a little bit in the paper, we're trying to bring him back to life for 90 minutes, primarily, and this is important. A lot of you probably read the paper, but I never saw him. So for me, the big part of this was to try to recreate him. And so I really went all over the world. We found videotapes in boxes in basements and all these kinds of places. And then, because it was about, I was trying to make the film for people who had never seen him. It was supposed to be for people who had seen him, but I wanted to make the film so that people who had never seen him could see what the people who had seen him are talking about. And so that's why we tried to do all that we did. And it was a huge job. I'd had an edit house in New York for many years, and so I had an experience with it. But for any of you who know a lot about like video and audio stuff, a tape that's 30, 40 years old, you have to bake it, dehydrate it. There are all these things you have to do in order for it to bring it back to life, because there's a good chance it's been ruined or whatever. And, Willie wasn't Bob Dylan, where everybody knew he was a big guy and therefore they kept everything in proper vaults and took care of all the footage. And this stuff was like, a lot of it's like dubs of the masters. The masters have disappeared. We found it everywhere. And a lot of it was doing, I learned all these things about how to use certain kinds of software to restore footage, all these things that you see more and more in movies. I had to learn. There's an old saying in the Mad Men, the TV series, where there was a woman who said, "This is America. You figure out what job needs to be done, and you become the person who does it." Right? And a lot of this was that, like learning how to do these things, because there wasn't a budget for a film about Willy DeVille. We had to figure out how to do it, and that's what we did.
Also, Larry had never done a documentary based about a musician before. Right. He's done a lot of documentaries. So, that brought me into the picture. And I wanted, certainly, to have his life story going alongside his music. Yeah, that was important to me.
Right. And to let it lead with that. There were these interviews, some of them you probably heard up front, that we had like subtitles for. That's because he was going to write a book in like the middle 2000s. And so he decided to record himself telling these stories. And he did it like on the cheapest possible, like Kmart, audio cassette player with a dog talking behind, and the New York City streets outside. And it was just like such a mess, to try to make it even somewhat legible. But it was him, It wasn't somebody talking about him. It was him telling his own story, and that was the big motivator.
This gentleman here had a question.
Don't you think when he first came out, or the record company tried to promote him, or like another Springsteen or something like that? In fact, I remember when the first album came out, I swear there were ads that said, "If you like Bruce Springsteen, you like this." And there were scenes in there where he looks a lot.
Well, he
couldn't fit that mold. I think he probably rebelled against it.
When he came from San Francisco, excuse me, back to the East Coast and went straight to the Village, and brought his musicians with him, and then picked up a guitar player, Louis Erlanger, who was in the movie, Louis X. They were playing in clubs for a couple of years all over New York, and even in Asbury Park. So Southside Johnny Lyon has told me, and Steve Van Zandt, that they remember going to see him, perform in Asbury Park before his first record came out, which means Bruce did too. So, I mean, they feel that he's part of them. There's the people that came up then would probably include John Mellencamp, on major labels.
Question is whether the DVD that came out in Europe is available here.
We'll see.
Working on it.
We're working on it. It's getting everything straight, but the film premiered in London in November. And since then, we've played in the U.S. only in New York City, Connecticut, and here, just 3 U.S. screenings. But we've probably had 40 screenings on the continent, primarily in the Netherlands and Belgium, and just tonight, actually, in Germany. And we have a lot more scheduled. So, we will, whatever does happen, probably will happen more in a larger way there first, because he was a star. I mean, here people remember him and they remember him fondly, but he was a legitimate star. He sold over 1 million records in Europe. So, yeah, but our plan is to keep barnstorming as we're doing. We're going to take a little time off in the summer, but we're going to be in California in September, 2 shows in Santa Monica. We're probably going to do San Francisco, and we're doing Toronto a month from now, 2 shows in Toronto. And so that's all we have planned right now for the North America, but we have probably 40 shows planned for Europe. And then actually today, it's funny, this is real-time stuff, I started talking to people about Australia. And we have something actually in Japan. So by the time we're said and done, I think we're going to have been everywhere. And hopefully that will lead to streaming. Streaming is very difficult to get for music documentaries for somebody who isn't a household name, especially at the moment. So a lot of the process of you coming out tonight and doing this is to try to, and bless his heart, Leland, and he's done so much. The Boston Globe, which he was directly responsible for the article, that helps us, it elevates the thing so that when we go to talk to the streaming people, they've already heard about it, right? They've talked to somebody who's seen it. That's what this is about. This is kind of like trying to make something ex nihilo, right? Out of nothing. And that's essentially what you all are a part of, is what we're trying to do here with Willy, is to try to bring him back in such a way that, hopefully our dream is one day some young artist will do a song of his.
Is he in the Hall of Fame?
Yes.
Did Capitol Records ever realize how stupid they were?
Did Capitol Records ever realize how stupid they were?
No, they were embarrassed by the fact that Rolling Stone,
Yeah.
which meant something back then, made it the, one of the top 3 albums of the year. So they actually were forced to put it out. But no, they, major labels in those days or today are, monolithic, and the people who signed him, the guy who signed him, unfortunately he passed away before we could film him for this film. There's a guy named Ben Edmonds, but I did talk to him a lot about this. Ben was from the Midwest and rose to prominence as a rock critic and a writer, and he wrote a book about Marvin Gaye that was, I think, won a Grammy, as biography. And he got a job. He was an editor at Rolling Stone, and he got a job from that offer to be an A&R man at Capitol. And his first assignment from the president of the label was to go down to this new bar, CBGB, and check out this band with Robert Gordon, the rockabilly singer, great singer. And so Ben went down, and the band right before was Mick DeVille, and Ben went back and said, to the president of the label, Robert Gordon's great, but I think we should sign Mick DeVille. So they went down and saw him, and they agreed, and they signed him. Ben, his next assignment right after that was find a producer. So he felt that, this is what he told me, from that movie, what was it called, with Mick Jagger? Yeah, that song, Memo from Turner. He felt that the vibe and the sound of that, this is Ben, the A&R guy, would be the right kind of vibe for Willy, for Mick DeVille, and that was Jack Nietzsche, who produced and co-wrote that song. So he called up Nietzsche in LA and said, I'd like you to listen to this demo we did with this new act we signed. And Nietzsche said, you know, I don't want to produce a rock and roll band now. I'm doing film scores and stuff. But Ben was persuasive, and Jack said, I'm going to be in New York next week. Yeah, I'll listen, you know. And they had recorded this demo of 5 tunes, and when they were recording it, Ben said to Willie, let's do a cover song. And what do you want to do? And Willie immediately said, These Arms of Mine by Otis Redding. And he said, and I want that to be the first one on the tape, right? So when, you know, a month later or something, when Ben brought Jack Nietzsche into the record plant to hear this demo, the first thing that came up was These Arms of Mine, and it got about halfway into the second verse, and Nietzsche said, stop, I'll do it. So things like that happened with him, you know.
He's just so cool. I mean, he just ripped cool.
Right. I thought so, but I mean, if it hadn't, I think at the time when I started playing with him, if he just looked cool, I don't know if that would have taken me, you know, 100%, but it was like, he really, really, I mean, Benny King, you know, I mean, the first time I played with him at the Ritz, you know, I looked over, did I tell this story over? I looked over on the side of the stage at the end, and there was Benny King, who I had played with, and we came off the stage before the, you know, encore, and I shook hands with Benny King, and I said, what are you doing here, Ben? And he said, well, I'm a friend of Willie's. I think he's a fantastic singer. I liked it, you know. And we all came back on stage and did Stand By Me as a duet for the encore. So that's why it was easy for me to call him up for this film. And he said, I loved Willie, and I loved his voice. And, you know, that kind of says it all, you know.
I have to say, too, it was wonderful to see Doc Pomus in there, and that whole part of it, I mean, talk about a match made in heaven. And I don't know if folks got to see the Doc Pomus documentary, AKA Doc Pomus, but we showed it here, and then it totally, like, disappeared. Like, you can't
It's back
see
now.
it. Is it?
Sharon Felder, you know, is the daughter of Doc Pomus, and she's in the film. And she was at our Brooklyn screening. She was on the panel, and they are bringing it back out. They're actually re-releasing it now. So, yeah, so I agree with you 100%. It's a great film. He's an incredible story. Doc Pomus is like his great...
For that Q&A in Brooklyn, she found a notebook she had saved of her father, of Doc Pomus. He always kept notes of about people he was writing with and his first impressions. And Willie came over to his place on 72nd Street, and the first session, and she had his notes, you know, like, you know, amazing voice, you know, blah, 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 you know, stuff like that. So, yes.
Sir?
I saw Nick probably 8 times and Willie a couple times. And first of all, Jan, I'm going to echo what Jan said. It's like he dripped cool. I don't think I've ever seen anybody ever with more charisma on stage. I saw him 5 different places, and also echoing what Peter Wolf said that night at the Middle East downstairs. The room wasn't even half full, but it didn't matter because the performance was just unbelievable. You know, he had a couple of these guys that were in the ladder and along with Boris on percussion, and the performance that night of Heaven Stood Still was just, the room was absolutely dropped something for you. I mean, you wouldn't hear it. It was just mind-blowingly great. Something I've never forgot. The last time he played was at the Regatta Bar in Harvard Square, and it was 4 years after that those scenes were showed from Berlin, August 31st, 2006. How he looked compared to 2002. He was completely gaunt, just did not look well at all, and the first thing he did inside the hotel, the fancy bar, was lit up a cigarette. Which is something, you know, long years after the smoking ban existed, he was always at least a pack of cigarettes during the whole set.
that story I told in the movie about what happened to us in Norway, where we ended up in jail, you know, a week before that, we'd been opening across Europe, so this is like 1983 or something, opening shows for Rod Stewart at stadiums. And the first show we did, opening for Rod Stewart in some sort of soccer stadium, you know, maybe in Sweden, we're standing ready to go on, and the big road manager from Rod Stewart has the wireless mic for the lead vocals, and he hands it to Willie, who's you know, got a cigarette, of course, and he says, so, you know, stage is yours, but there's a big platform coming out into the audience, you know, for Rod to run out there, you know, and perform. And the road manager says, but one thing, don't go out on that platform. You know, you can't do that, you know. You understand? And Willie, I remember I was standing right next to him. Willie went, took his cigarette like that, you know, grabbed the mic, walked right out onto that platform, and we did the first song, which was something from that Atlantic album. It was like a real rocker, you know. And that was him.
I've been telling people that smoking is good for something. You know, B.B. King, some of the great singers were smokers, but I don't recommend smoking. I love the film, but I had a question for you. You interspersed like real blues, real Cajun, some old fiddle music. And why? What was that decision for? Because Willie, I think you could say, was influenced by blues. It does sound like blues is a big part of what he plays. Slide. But he really wasn't a blues. That's not really what his thing. So why did you put real old blues music in for the
Did everyone hear the question?
Why did I put the old blues music up front, etc.? Because that was what they were listening to. He had a friend who was sort of like his musical guru, and
Growing up.
yeah, Willie did. You know,
When they were growing up.
yeah, growing up, and they were really into like all that really old stuff, and so I put there because I wanted to give a sense of what was getting into him at an early time, and also obviously I put the old Irish music in there because Willie always played with this idea of being like this dark Latino figure, but Willie was like 100% Irish, so I wanted to, you know, and I just wanted I wanted to sort of put what was underneath all of that. And so those were really the reasons I did that. And that particular music was music that I heard that he had actually listened to.
It's a little bit silly, but one thing that I couldn't get over when I saw Paradise, and he had on this orange, sharkskin suit, they were the tightest pants I've ever seen. I didn't know, I mean, I just couldn't.
I think that was the thing. You know, this is a story I haven't told anywhere else, and it's not in the film, but his sister, Willie's sister, told me this story, that when Willie was young, Stanford was like, kind of like a commuter city around Boston too, in that like, it was indeed a Rust Belt industrial city, but there was also a big contingent of people who commuted from New York City every day. So it had a little bit of that too. It wasn't all just like out in, you know, Midwest somewhere. And so in the neighborhood he grew up in, even though it was a neighborhood where his father built the house, and, you know, his father was a carpenter, it was very blue collar, up the street was a guy who was a music publisher or sort of an agent in New York, and he commuted back and forth. And he had a party one night, and at the party was Judy Holliday. And Willie was friends with that guy's son. So Willie was there that night. I mean, he was really young, but he went on and on to Mimi about how glamorous she was. She came up in a big Cadillac. She had all these clothes, and she was just this presence. And I think in a lot of ways that was a big deal in his life, right? It was even before all the West Side Story stuff. It was this idea of a glamorous musician, you know, and she, you know, everything was right about her, and everything, her presentation, like it was like, he always said, you listen through your eyes, right? And so that, what you're talking about was, he was always thinking about that when you hear something, you're seeing it. And the way you see it is the way you actually hear it too.
Okay, well, we have time for one more question right there.
This is a quick one. Any cross-pollination between Willie and Lou Reed?
You should take that one.
Well, I mean, I worked with Lou a few times. You know, I honestly don't know. You know, Lou may have been more cantankerous person than Willie, even. You know, so I can't imagine what.
Well,
But
there
Lou was also changeable. You know, I mean, he could be really sweet, you know, or he could be really, you know, nasty. I know he loved R&B hugely. Lou did. And so that they might have bonded over that, you know what I mean? And both of them were really knowledgeable about obscure rhythm and blues stuff. This is a little sidebar.
I mean, really could be a rooster, you know what I mean, to other musicians. I mean, he was not the nicest person to other people who were sort of in the same world. I'm sure with Lou Reed, it was probably a complicated relationship. The true story, though, is that when they were doing Miracle, which is a record that Storybook Love was on, Lou Reed was supposed to write with him. And evidently, he bailed on Willie, and Willie was pretty pissed about that. So there was that sort. So that obviously indicates that they had some relationship. But I don't know. I think Willie probably would say he didn't like Lou Reed, but he did.
I mean, I don't live in the city anymore. You know, I live outside of New York, but a suburb. But when I lived in the city, for 20, 25 years,
You're talking about, Lou in when you saw him in the city.
Oh, I in the 80s, I also worked with Buster Poindexter, David Johansen, a lot. You know, we did all the albums and toured. And at the time, my girlfriend threw a surprise birthday party for me in the East Village at my place. And she invited both Willie and David, who hated each other. So, but that's an interesting question about Lou. I mean, quick aside, about 20 years ago, we, the Uptown Horns, did an album with Howard Tate when he was rediscovered, and the album was called Rediscovered. And when the album was through, they had a record release party in the Village, and a lot of people came because Howard Tate was discovered. Everybody thought he was dead, and Lou Reed came, and I was standing, before the thing started, before we played, and he came, and I knew him, so he came up to me and he goes, "Who's the producer
of
Jerry Ragavoy produced that album, and Jerry was there with his wife, and Lou came up to me and said, "Can you introduce me to Jerry?" And I said, "Sure," and he says, because he wrote and produced the greatest song ever in R&B history. This is Lou Reed talking. And I said, "Great," and it was "Stay With Me" by Lorraine Ellison. And so I brought him over, and he was like a little kid. Lou, "I'm so great to meet you. I love you. So they could have bonded over music. I think Willie and Lou.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and sticking around. And special thanks to Larry Locke and Crispin Cioe for joining us. I do want to say, for those of you who want to continue the party, our friends down at the Monotony Grill, a mile down Mass Ave, they've got great music, no cover charge, and Brian Templeton is playing there tonight, a great blues singer, and the band's always great. And they have a late night menu till 11, so just wanted to pitch our friends at the Monotony Grill. And drive home safely or get home safely, however you're going.
Thank you.
Thank you.